There's some people who are very much more confident in teaching this than me. I have my leanings, but those leanings are not concrete. I am still figuring this out a little bit because it gets into the field of, in my opinion, it gets into a little bit of the field of speculation. Because when you hit Second Temple period, which in your notes I made it really short because my brain was just trying to find some way to simplify it, and the best way I could do it was quoting this other guy, so it wasn't super long. So I quote him 3 times. I thought he did a great job, far better than I can do. There are so many theories are just flying around. There's like 2 major theories. But it gets messy, in my opinion, and gets crazy and all over the place. Because they're trying to figure out angels and all this stuff. So they're like saying everything in nature is connected to an angel, like every element, every tree. And it's like, at what point are we just pantheists? Minus the fact we have one God. It goes crazy. And then you have the New Testament where they're like, they reference it, but it's much more chill. So it's like, what's happening? So I'm going to do my best. Please feel free to interrupt me. To ask questions or to throw a thought out there. My hope is that I'll present things in a way that at least kind of gets the ball rolling for thinking. And if you're curious, this is probably the most academic. I reference this. This is Demons, Angels, and Writings in Ancient Judaism. It's very heavy lifting, but it's informative. This is probably really good if you're looking more into like the history of like the development of language. Versus like it explain the doctrine to you is like, here's where this word comes from, here's where this kind of develops, all that kind of stuff. I forgot the cover to this because I'm a dingbat. This is Michael Heiser's Demons. This is his companion to Angels. It is bigger. It is definitely more of the very accessible. But it's still heavy lifting. Like it's very weird, but it's helpful. Then there's this one, Demons and Spirits in Biblical Theology, by John Walton and his son, J. Harvey Walton. This one is interesting because there's a lot of areas where they agree with Heiser and Reed. There's also places where they disagree. So it's just kind of interesting, just kind of have like different schools of thought on that. There's much more. I thought these 3 were probably the most accessible from what I was reading. So if you're curious about that, this is probably the easiest one to get through because this whole purpose is to make it easy. This one, they're not expecting laymen to read it, but I think laymen can if you're willing to just embrace the ancient Near East a little bit. Buckle up. But it's a good time. So if you're curious, you can check those out or whatever. So if we look at demons, this one is going to be interesting just because I find it funny that I'm pretty sure somewhere in the Torah, I can't remember where, God tells them not to kind of be hooked up on these things. And then they did. And then we get the Second Temple time period, which we're going to shorthand because we're kind of combining it into the Old Testament section. And then we'll look at a brief summary of it. But they went off the wazoo when it came to spiritual beings. So technically, this is the weird, hard part, especially for us. There are technically 0 words for demons, technically, in every scholarship I found. The closest you get is Shadim and daimonion. Problem is daimonion in its classical Greek sense is not used strictly for demons. When you look at all the other places it's used, it can be used to refer to that. It can also be used to refer to general spiritual beings. It can refer to philosophy, like things in philosophy, so like things regarding our spirit. It can be used to refer to the gods. It can be referred to a whole list of things. It is not strictly demon. But the reason we kind of get that is because the authors of the Septuagint and the New Testament are using it in a way to kind of like lower the status by not calling the other beings God. There's places where they might allow it still to make a point. Like they might call the devil Theos in one spot, or they'll say that that they bow down to Theos in other places. But primarily they reserve Theos for Yahweh. And then they spend more time referring to the other beings as like daimonion, spirits, kind of like demeaning them, referring to how lesser they are. And then the context around it determines if they are of the good guy kind or the bad guy kind. Shadim, we'll see in a second, is translated as demon because the Septuagint translates Shadim as daimonion. But remember, daimonion doesn't strictly mean demon, refers to spirits. But also there's pneuma that means spirits. So this is like weird mixture of like pneuma mean like the spiritual beings, but then daimonion, which can be used of a whole bunch of things. Again, they use it for philosophy, like regarding yourself and the spirit that's in you and all these things. If a few weeks ago when Caleb was giving his teaching on Trinity, I said my brain is hurting on the word of classical Greek, that was this word. The dictionary I was reading through was about 10 pages long, which for a dictionary is long when you're getting 10 pages on one word. That should not be a thing. But it was. Because it's just used a lot. And then Shadim, it borrows from another language. It seems to be rerooted in Akkadian, which is not strictly used for demons either. So that's, I wouldn't say it's a wrong choice, but it's very interpretive. So that's why I say technically we do not have a word that means demon in, I guess, the way that we tend to come to think of as demon. However, that doesn't mean that we can't translate them as demon and we can't understand them as demons. It's just that if we go back to their time, it's not like there's like, this is the word that means like demons. When you get to the Septuagint, again, they start to like put these words down because they're trying to differentiate between the lesser gods who are not in God's payroll, as Heiser would call it, regarding the divine council and the angels, and then the angels being like they are in this payroll, like that they do work for him, or they are from him. And then, but then the New Testament doesn't really play a ton into that language. I did my word study. I think like more often than not, the root words were used like in the single digits. If they were using the double digits, I think it was like in the tens. So very, very rare compared to spirits. And then around the medieval period is when they really classify as demons, bad guy, angels, good guy. So the development of terminology, it's a long one, is rooted in Septuagint trying to clarify things for its Greek readers. Medieval period when we really get into this means good guy, this means bad guy. Prior to that, there's like a whole plethora of words, which makes it weird and hard to, at least for me, when you're not like a scholar, to kind of wrap my head around. But we're going to do our best. So a couple of these we went through last week, so I'm going to blow through these a little bit quickly. We have ruach in Hebrew, which refers to spirits. In general, it also refers to breath and also refers to wind. So like that, the very fact that you breathe is like a sort of wind. There's an idea that perhaps like the wind is almost like the breath of God or like the breath of these other spirits kind of moving around and stuff. Some have argued that perhaps ancient Jews kind of thought like the wind being the presence of God moving by and all that kind of stuff, which is a beautiful thought. You just have to be careful with when you throw that down because there's times where that doesn't seem to be the case. And you also have the idea that, okay, we breathe, and so we have our ruach that is of God, so therefore it's technically his ruach, but is in us. So it's the breath of life, or the wind of life, or is our spirit. Sometimes this is how it would be translated. And so it's this animating thing that is immaterial that we all breathe, but also is us. And it flows inside and out of us, and also goes by us. And it's a whole weird thing. It's a beautiful word, but it's weird. Especially when we just kind of differentiate those things. You get Elohim, we've mentioned this many times, where it's the word that we tend to translate as God. That's fine, but we have to make sure that we don't immediately come to the idea like, oh, we're talking about polytheism when we're using this. Many scholars have pointed out that no, they weren't polytheists that eventually became monotheists. It's like Elohim was just a term for that of the spiritual world, or representatives on earth, like Moses being called an Elohim. We talked about how that's kind of the idea that he refused to truly be the prophet towards Pharaoh. So Moses, God is speaking through Moses, and therefore Moses is acting as the Elohim for Aaron as prophet. And it's like this little chain, but ultimately God is the true Elohim. You get Zar, or Tsar, the Z, I screwed up there. Tsar. And that one we saw with in the Book of Daniel with Michael, where it is used of like this idea of a prince. And we think of like divine council stuff and like these rulers over the nations, or like the archangels. It kind of makes sense to kind of give some kind of royal terminology to them. So we looked at that last week a little bit, just to read through them again. But I will tell you what is inscribed in the Book of Truth. There is none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince, referring to Israel here. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time, but at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. These are words we've gone through before to kind of identify beings. We kind of talked about the idea of this. Some of those were kind of easier to get my head wrapped around because they were almost like, they made sense. Holy ones, they're in heaven, they're holy, they're in his presence, they're set apart. Princes, I can understand that one. Then you get to demons and things just get weird. So the first one, I'm going to try and cruise through this a little bit. Please feel free to stop me if you need me to. Rephaim, sometimes rendered as shades, dead, departed, giants, or just transliterated as Rephaim. Difficulty with the word is that there are figures who are linked to the Rephaim like Goliath. So we have here in Book of Samuel, and Ishbi Benob, one of the descendants of the Rephaim, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze and who was armed with a new sword, thought to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and attacked the Philistine and killed him. And David's men swore to him, "You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." After this, there was again war with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai, the Hushathite, struck down Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob. And Elhanan, the son of Jaireh-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was again war at Gath. There was a man of great stature. And we're again describing these great height, and they're called giants, great height. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These four were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David, by the hand of his servants. And here the word that is being translated is Rephaim. So if we continue though, so Rapha has the same root as Rephaim, but here it is linked to descendants. This idea is repeated again in 2 Chronicles with an alternate spelling of Rapha being consistent as the root. There was again war at Gath. There was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he also was descended from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David, by the hand of his servants. Okay, so why are we talking about this? Well, when you look at the other places Rephaim is used, is, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is also used of the dead. In fact, there's times where it's like in the Psalms chastising these rulers who are Rephaim down in the underworld. And it's kind of like mocking them a little bit, or saying, or mocking the king, I will go down to them. Like he's no better than these Rephaim, these giants or shades or whatever. What's also weird is that the root refers to heal at times. However, Rephaim are not ever described as one who heals within the Bible. You get Ugaritic texts using similar constructions, but do not refer to the Rephaim in terms of being giants. When used as a noun, refers to divine residents of the underworld. So in Ugaritic texts, they use it of the underworld, these beings. It's like they're dead beings. But you have the Bible here who's using Rephaim to refer to living giants even, and then sometimes also the dead. So we see that the Old Testament in the above spots does tie them to giants. So we have giants whose dead spirits are in the underworld. They are residents there, but of a specific kind. It is not merely we become Rephaim, but a certain group are Rephaim. You'll see why that word's important. I start with that one because we'll see why. The first set of words we're looking at are associated with death. Rephaim is associated with these spirits that are like, for instance, when you have like Samuel being conjured up, it refers to him as an Elohim. It refers to these ones specifically as Rephaim, not even just like dead, but like Rephaim, which is used in, like we said before, as Ugarit for underworld, but then is being used here to refer to these giants, which is weird. We'll see why the connection is there. If we keep going with some of the death words, we'll have like Moet and Mot. So we have death, plague of god of death, realm of the dead, dying, die, etc. Quite literally means death, but is found to be personified in multiple instances. We have Jeremiah 9:21, Hosea 13:14, Psalm 49:14, etc., where it talks about like death swallowing or death doing this, death doing that. This will be done to death. It's also the name of the Canaanite deity who is Mot, and he's ruler of death in the underworld. We read about him in the Chaos Monsters where he and Baal clash. And so it's interesting because Baal would be like the storm god, which means it's connected to fertility because he provides the water to nurture the ground, which then provides food for people. So it's all connected to him. So it's kind of like the god of life in a sense, and then the god of death in competition. Technically, Baal is not the god of life, but that's kind of like the outcome of what he does. This was not but however, they don't refer to Ma as a deity here. So this was not the case for the biblical writers, as there is no duality of a god of death. Like there's not like God who is life and then there's the god of death. That doesn't exist. Pretty much death is still under God's purview, but he may delegate something or maybe like kind of give over this rule or something, but he still has the ultimate authority over all of it. So we have here Heiser saying that death was under the authority of Yahweh. Nevertheless, biblical writers drew on broad Semitic notions that there was a spirit entity who was Lord over the realm of the dead. God may sovereignly send someone to the underworld, but certain texts put forth the idea that the dead would be under the authority of its master. So there's a master of death, but it's not like he's in dual competition with God. Death is the product of sin. So it's not like there's a god of sin and a god of death. God is the only one who is God. But there is one who kind of rules over and claims people for himself because of what sin is doing. It's this weird... There's a clear line, but it is really weird sometimes to kind of talk about it where you don't want to give this guy over here more credit than he actually has. But you recognize that he does have something that is allowed for him to have. That God over here is like, sure, you can have that, but know that I'm still in charge. Death appear, and this is a long quote. This I'm not going to read through it all. It's just an example of like where death is used. He kind of demonstrates this entire example. Is a really good article within the Dictionary of Deities and Demons. It's a great reference for these things if you want to look more into like different spiritual beings within the ancient Near East and within the Bible. It gets into like Canaanites and the Ugaritics and all, just pretty much like almost all of them within this area. It gets into and describes what their texts show. So just to read a couple key things. We'll start at the beginning of it. Death appears, for example, in personified guise in Hosea 13:14. Shall I ransom them, Ephraim, from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? Death, where are your plagues? Sheol, where is your destruction? Here the personification is very clear, but there is no need to assume a mythological overtone or to rule it out. So we have like, okay, is there something about where death has some kind of claim, but God still has the ability, as it shows in Revelation, to destroy death itself. Whatever that really officially means is for another day. Its power is still subject to God's ultimate power, but it seems to have like some kind of claim of some sort. It is difficult. If I skip much lower, it is difficult to be sure whether these texts reflect awareness of the Baal-Mot conflict, since the veracity of death may well have been an idea which existed independently of the myth. In Job 18:13-14, the personification is taken a step further in that death's firstborn son, disease, is mentioned, but there is no evidence of Ugaritic Mot having offspring. So you have the biblical authors kind of going a bit further. The idea of disease can lead to death is like a descendant of death in some sense. And this is in the wisdom literature section. So we're not saying that disease is literally an offspring, but the idea that because there's death, disease tends to bring people to death. Therefore, there's some kind of relation that's there. Go back down even further. Another case in which there is a close parallel with the Ugaritic text is Psalm 49:15, which says, "Of the overconfident like sheep they are appointed for Sheol, death shall be their shepherd, straight to the grave they descend," where we have death leading people into Sheol, and this reflects the way the Ugaritic text conveyed the idea that it is necessary to beware of Malt since he can entrap the innocent and is specifically mentioned as consuming sheep. He is not, however, a shepherd in Ugaritic. In Cant 8:6, the strength of Mot is proverbial and compared with the power of love. Mot's strength may be seen also in his fight with Baal. Mot was strong, Baal was strong. However, Kasuto misinterpreted a phrase in the Ugaritic letter as providing a parallel with Cant 8:6. Mot is there described as strong and may be personified, but there is no reference to love since Yid Elim is a disease. In many cases, it is far from clear whether the Canaanite Mot is being alluded to in biblical passages or not. So death is personified. That's why we kind of have this word being connected to it, because you do have places where death has an offspring, death is burning people here, death is doing this, death is doing that. And it's acting like death has its own power, but you also have texts before where it talks about God is the one who provides life and takes away life. It seems to be more, and so he sent, and there's a sense where you do go to Sheol because you are dead, your body and your spirit are disconnected. Your person hasn't changed, it's just the combination of what you are has been distinguished, separated. And when you go down there, he allows you to be separated due to sin and being like the thing that the wage, as Paul says, the wages of sin is death. So what we are owed is death. And so he allows it to happen, but there is someone who is like trying to claim as many as he can to remain in death, as if he can. And wants to bring about more death and more chaos. So if you want to read more about that, you can go check out Dictionary of Demons, Deities and Demons. So the author of Hebrews attributes the power of death to the devil, where he says, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who, through fear of death, were subject to lifelong slavery." If we think back to our devil notes, this idea that the devil has this preeminence amongst the other spiritual rebels, which seems to be implying this, and the fact that he's the ruler of this world, he's the god of this world, seems to be implying that because of what happens in what I argued in Genesis 3, death has entered the picture of the human story. He's one of the causes of that, and because he's sent down to the ground, which we mentioned before months ago about how he's sent to the Eretz, and there's places where you can see that also can be referred to the ground literally, but also the underworld is being used of that. And you have this kind of language. It seems to be that he's the reason that people are dying and he's dragging people down. So there's a sense in which he has his power to do this, even though God has the ultimate power. And it's just this weird thing, but there's no duality. But yet he does seem to have this layer of control that God has allowed for a time. We keep going. There is also similar language, similar term of metim, in which Deuteronomy 18:11 has the dead that is being approached. This seems to refer to dead human beings, though. We have then this conglomeration of obot, and oberim. This terminology relates to geographical locations, such as oboth and abarim. So to quote Dictionary of Deities and Demons again, but a different author, K. Sprunk, the participle, qualitative, plural oberim of the verb to pass from one side to the other seems to have a special meaning in the context of the cult of the dead, denoting the spirits of the dead crossing the border between the land of the living and the world of the dead. It can be interpreted as a divine name in Ezekiel 39:11 through 14, which may also have been preserved in the geographical name Abarim, is Ugaritic cognate, then would be found in places like KTU 122:15. So we have in passages where it says the valley of the Oberim is located east of the sea, which is probably the Dead Sea. So it was part of the Transjordan. This is a region which shows many traces of ancient cults of the dead, such as the megalithic monuments called dolmens and place names referring to the dead and the netherworld. So we have this word that is tied to a location. So you're going to find places where we might transliterate a word, but there's a background of a place being associated with death, and therefore you find words in Hebrew that are often being used to refer to this passing through of the realm of the dead and the realm of the living, or something like that. So you have like spiritual beings who are going back and forth. They're something that they're not bound necessarily strictly to that. Ov or Ob is sometimes translated as a medium. So you have some places where we translate it as medium, saying like it's humans speaking to them. But the word refers technically to the spirit of the dead, according to the Hebrew Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. So it wouldn't necessarily just be that there's a medium, but the mediums are the ones that are talking to them. So the mediums are talking to the Ob. It's not so much that the Ob are mediums, but the Ob are the ones that the mediums are talking to. So you need a medium to talk to them. And so they would be called, spirit can communicate with human mediums called from the underworld of the dead. And we have many places where this is done. And one of the things that God says is, don't you dare ever do this. And then they do anyways. It's like when Saul kicks them out and then he goes seeks one out. So we have, I know it's like kind of like okay, we have all these big words, but I think at least we understand like a little bit of what they kind of mean, kind of unpacks more of how they viewed those who are in rebellion or those who are the enemies. Right now, so far, there is a clear distinction or a clear emphasis on the fact that they have some connection to death itself. That death is personified and the spiritual beings who are rebellion to God have some association with death. Just kind of speed through this a little bit more. You have Yedoni, so spirit of divination, necromancers, soothsayers, which is rooted in Yid, which refers to knowing. So like the knowing ones. So there would be knowing, spirit of divination, one in whom that spirit dwells. So based on above, two words in the lexical support, passages such as Leviticus 19:31 should be translated, do not turn to ghosts / spirits or knowing ones. It might refer to itself as mediums and like soothsayers or something like that. But it's referring to the idea, don't communicate with these ghosts or spirits or the ones who have this knowledge. Don't associate with the ones who have knowledge. Why would they have knowledge? Well, because they've been around a long time. They have a lot of knowledge. And even if they haven't been around a long time, they know stuff that we just don't, because they're not bound into our world as we are. So do not seek them out, and so make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord, as opposed to mediums and necromancers. The point here should not escape the reader. While Yedoni, knowing one, and Ob may at times be used of human mediums, the failure to note that they also refer specifically to supernatural entities results in missing Old Testament terminology of evil spirits. Now, I can keep going through a bunch of these, so I'm just going to summarize them going forward. I think we got a little bit of a taste of what these ones so far are. Because if you go to Chavi and Habeon, you have it referring to like an actual deity in Ugarit, where he has described as having horns and a tail. And this is being that's associated as like just kind of like this enemy with death and stuff, which might be some of the early origins of the idea of the devil being one with horns and tails. Might be ones where they're kind of like taking it. The other thing too is that we'll see is it would be a strange mixture as well. The idea of like this humanoid, but with animal, which in Israel is like a no-no. You don't have mixtures of any sort. That's opposed to life, opposed to boundaries and all these things. So this could be one of the origins of that. There's just more you could read about that. You have Shadim. This is one we typically translate as Hebrew as demons, such as in Deuteronomy 4. But just a quick note, so it's a loan word from Assyrian shedu, which means a protecting spirit or territorial spirits of sort. And so if we go to Walton over here, what the word originally referred to, we do not technically fully know, although the context indicates that they would not have been understood as class 2 spirits. Explain what class 2 spirits are. So go to Deuteronomy 32:17. It will read, they sacrificed unto demons in some translations, which were, some will say, not gods. We talked before why that's a poor translation, but majority will say not to God, so they were not God. And they will say to gods whom they did not know, to new gods that came newly up, whom your fathers did not fear. So we're talking about Israel here, and this is kind of where Walton gets this idea of class 1, 2, and 3 spirits. And so I just kind of want to point out what that verse says first, because it mentions that they're ones being sacrificed to. So Walton argues, based on the ancient Near East, that you have what is called class 1 spiritual beings, which referring to gods which would be more specifically those who receive sacrifices. It'd be one of the like extremes. Like you have class 2 is like the middle. You have class 1, which is one extreme. Class 3 is another extreme. Class 1, these are the ones who receive sacrifices. You have all the way over here, class 3, which would be those who were formerly human, which are ghosts or like spirits. The dead human spirits have passed on. You then have class 2, which is in the middle, which refers to everything in between. So he's saying that it's based on how the ancient Near East works, it would not be, he doesn't think it'd be right to say that when we're saying that they're being sacrificed to demons, or referring to Shadim, that it literally means that we're sacrificing. He's arguing that they would be referring to, at least within the ancient Near East, they're sacrificing to other Elohim. But when the New Testament is using Shadim and the Septuagint is using daimonion, they're devaluing what they actually are, which is why it doubles down by saying they're not God. But then it goes and calls them gods, these new gods, these spirits who seem to have been misusing authority that they have. And then you also have the very fact that it's tied to territorial, which gets into this thing that's called cosmic geography. So like Israel is God's people and it's his land. You find places where it's called like Zion is his mountain. Sinai is called his mountain. But then you have in Ugara where they have these other mountains that are like claimed of the gods there. And so like there's like this like claiming of these things. Now ultimately everything's belonged to Yahweh, but within the idea of this framework, they're saying like this is God, this is God's place, meaning that this is where he's choosing to reside. This is where he's choosing to be with his people, as opposed to the other nations that he's allowed and given up to everything else. So not to say that demons is a bad translation, but to kind of get more of an idea of what's going on behind the word. So with this logic in mind, Shadim refers to beings that are resident deities. So if we go back further into Deuteronomy 32, back to verse 15, it would imply that they weren't really over them before, or they're newly introduced to them, meaning they're not Yahweh. Yeah. They're foreign to the covenant that he's making with them. It would seem to be that Deuteronomy 32 is alluding to the fact that when that happened, some people have different thoughts on it. Some people, we'll get into this briefly, some people argue that when God dispersed them, he dispersed them and therefore allowed other rebel spirits to kind of claim them. So like kind of like truly giving them over to this. And then some will say that it was dispersed to the other angels, but then the angels get corrupted at some point. Either way, it seems to be tying to this, because if Shadim is purling from Shadu, which is like a territorial spirit, that means that it would be another nation's spirit that they're worshiping that's not Yahweh's, and therefore they are new to the covenant that God actually has with them. We'll wrap up with a couple other Hebrew words. This is not all of them. This is not an exhaustive list. So I'll just quickly go through one other key one. You have Azazel, a figure that is mentioned in Leviticus 16 regarding the Day of Atonement. And so it is, and this figure also reappears in First Enoch as being one of the ones who rebels when it's reflecting back on Genesis 6. He's seen as being one of the ones that kind of is partaking and helping lead in that rebellion. And so in this practice, specific sacrifices were made, and then 2 ghosts were used, one that is being used and given over towards God, and one is sent out into the wilderness. And so it's not this idea of like there's like this even payment, but its idea is there's a giving over to Yahweh, and the other is sent into the wilderness towards Azazel, which is a banning and purging the Israelites of impurities so that they may be purified of death, sin, basically kind of like sending off the sins into the realm of chaos and death, saying like, get out of here. This is all purified. This is going back to you. We're getting the demons and spirits kind of like out of here kind of thing. And it's said that's being given over to Azazel, who would be like one of the rebellious spirits. And then you get several other words I have below. These can refer to other deities. They also at times refer to like certain kind of animals and hybrids. You have many other words, such as chaos words, which we saw with like Leviathan and stuff. Referring to death and destruction and chaos and spiritual beings. There's a whole lot of long list of words that are just used to describe them. So it's not like we have like one singular word that means demon in the Hebrew. It's like there's all these different ways to describe them. A large portion is associated with rebellious and sinful rulers over the nations, but then also something related to connection to death. Now let's get into some of the more fun stuff, aka reading the Bible. Rebellions. We're going to look at 3 main rebellions, all within Genesis 1 through 11. One of them I've already done a whole thing on, so I brought some of the notes back over. We will not read through all the notes because I've already gone over this, unless you guys really, really want to. Let's go to Genesis 3, which is our first rebellion. So if you think way, way back when, this is months ago, we talked about several words, and this is before the chaos monster stuff. So we have the serpent was more crafty than the beast of the field that the Lord had made. So clearly this is more than a serpent because it's talking. And this would not be a zoology lesson. For the love of all that is good, stop saying this was a literal snake that transformed into it was a lizard that turned into a snake. For the love of all that is good, please stop saying that. Not what it's about. We have some of the key words here. We have the fact that it's being called crafty. So that's the word arum. We saw that this is a word regarding wisdom. It can be used negatively, but there's often cases, especially in the Proverbs, where it's used very positively. So this serpent has this layer of wisdom about him, and he's going to be misusing said wisdom. Such knowledge he's going to be misusing. So he uses this knowledge to deceive Eve in order to kind of get him or get her to rebel against God. And we kind of talked about what all those different implications that meant with the idea of like Ezekiel and Isaiah. So not on his belly, meaning it's not saying that when I talk about it going down on its belly, we're not talking about how, again, it lost legs and now it crawls around today. We now have snakes. That's not what that means. We see in other places such as Ezekiel.
That's defeat language.
Defeat language, very good. It's defeat language because it is it's eating dust of the ground, effectively. It's crawling on the ground. It's below all the other ones. And Ezekiel and Isaiah also points to it being like something more spiritual is happening here. The later prophets look back on this like there is an actual spiritual figure here. It's not a snake. It's not a possession of a snake. That one was one of the more wild ones I remember reading. Oh, the snake was possessed. So why is it punished? It did nothing wrong. It's not held to a standard. Why are snakes being punished? That's not really what it just didn't really add up. But we have here is that there's this creature, and we saw with Walton and Heiser that refers to also like this chaos creature. We saw before in Genesis 1, there's the sea monster, but the next time we see a serpent is in Genesis 3, who's coming from the Sade, from the field. And so it's coming from the realm that is outside the garden, therefore it's coming from chaos and death. Yeah, exactly. So we have the chaos monster idea, but then the prophets are saying there was more than just a chaos monster. Like it's not just like just a narrative. This is a spiritual rebel. Or at least that's the way they seem to look at it. Some people argue Adam. I don't find that convincing. They try to base it off the Septuagint, but the Hebrew doesn't really give room for that. And so that seems to be like a later interpretation of the Septuagint translators. But we also remember, if we think way back, we looked at Isaiah 6, where we saw seraphim, and they're described as like these serpents with wings, and they're like this venomous presence about them, and this fire presence. And when you consider the fact that the Israelites are engaging with Ugaritic or Babylonian ideas, but also they're coming out of Egypt, it doesn't seem far-fetched to draw on a mixture of these cultures that are around them that they're influenced by and saying, look, here's a spiritual rebel here. Because you have Ezekiel and Isaiah kind of like referring to, I think it was Ezekiel, refers to him as a cherub, but you have Isaiah 6 referring to seraphim. They're coming from Egypt, where the idea of snakes being tied to wisdom and angels are there. But you also have the Ugaritic idea of cherubim. And so it seems to be taking all of them and saying together, like, this is something spiritual is happening here. We then talked about why I argue this is the actual rebellion of the devil. This is not the devil rebelled some eon before. You can still argue that, but it seems when you have Ezekiel and Isaiah, it seems to be alluding to this specific spot. And if it's referring to this spot as his rebellion, makes sense that Genesis 3 would be the rebellion, especially since it's right after two creation discussions. You have a rebellion rather than, two creation. By the way, there's this guy that he rebelled a long time ago. We don't know when. It seems to flow better in the story when it says that it was there. And so if you want to go through all my notes regarding that, I recopied it there. However, I would recommend going back to the actual devil notes because we have much more over there. So that's rebellion number 1, Genesis 3. Single rebel, 2 human rebels. A rebel with them in some sort. You then get the second rebellion.
Genesis 6.
Genesis 6, very good. This is where we get some different views. I'm going to summarize all three. I'm going to tell you the one that I side with, and we're going to move forward with that one because if we went through with all three of them, we'd be here forever. If you want to go through all three of them at some point, let me know, and I will put the notes together. But I'm not going to argue why one view over the other. I'm just going to tell you the three views, my personal take on it, and we're going to work through with that one. So the first one being the Sethite view. The sons of God here are the sons of Seth, who mix with the sons of Cain's line. Sons of God were being Seth because this is of the one who is faithful, but the fact that the others are not, like, call this, they're the daughters of the unfaithful. Bad mixture of families. Not out of the question. This has been done and talked about before. Don't mix with this family, this nation or this nation. You can see why they're trying to get that idea. You have the royal polygamy view. The sons of God are rulers who engage in polygamous relations with women that bring about violence and destruction. There is some reason to argue from this, and you do find some reasons for it. However, there's probably like two major branches within the royal polygamy view. Some, like Walton, would say that the sons of God, Walton Sr. and Walton Jr. say similar things, but also different things. Walton Sr. would say that this is the royal kingdom thing, and the Nephilim are a separate issue from the relations that are being had. His son seems, from what I've read, and I might be misunderstanding, but it seems that he thinks that the Nephilim are still a separate issue. They're this weird, more than human thing, but there was something spiritual and royal about the relations that happen, but they're not necessarily connected. I might be misunderstanding, maybe just like giving a different wording compared to his father, and I'm willing to grant that. But those are like two of like the views. There's other ways of explaining it, but those are like the two like more prominent ways. Number three would be the spiritual beings view, which is the sons of God are spiritual rebels who defy their domain and engage in unnatural mixing, as well as teach humans destructive practices. This is the view that these notes will follow. We're going to follow through with this view. I'm going to explain briefly why. There's more reasons why I fall under view number three. In short, when you look at the very specific phrase, sons of God, everywhere else I could find where you have sons of God like put together, they are almost, if not always, 99% of the time, if not 100% of the time, refers to spiritual beings, such as Deuteronomy 32:8, Job 1:6, Job 2:1, and Job 38:7. Every single one of those instances refers to spiritual beings. To me, it makes sense that we're going to be used similar terminology. However, authors are not always using univocal terminology. Like, for instance, Luke uses a Greek word slightly differently than Matthew does. I think it's those two. It doesn't make either one more right or wrong, because you understand the author and his context and how he is choosing to write and explain certain things. But when you consider that Deuteronomy 32:8 is of the Torah and it seems to be linked to Moses, at least you have that principle there, which seems to allude to that idea. And then if you have Job, which some people have argued might be the oldest text, some people have argued it's not the oldest text. If it is the oldest text, then you have the principle of sons of God existing before Torah. If it's not the oldest text, you still have this continuation of the specific language. You do see Israel being called a son, singular. You see David being called a son, singular. You see places where there are times referring to as sons or son, but the specific phrase sons of God seems to be, from what I could find, is almost always used of spiritual beings. So it makes sense to say that this would be of the same position, because it doesn't, there's nothing there that kind of, in my opinion, that really kind of says otherwise or forces another opinion. Not only that, but you have the Septuagint, which supports this. It refers to like the angels are the ones that are, and they'll use angelos, so the sons, as angelos. And then you have First Enoch in the Book of the Watchers, which describes the gathering of these angels on Mount Hermon, also known as Bashan, where they conspire to go down to the land, take wives, and teach mankind vile actions, such as warfare, potions, magic, understanding the stars, etc. And this produces giants that are the mixture of the heavenly and earthly, known as Nephilim, warrior giants. And the church seems to kind of go with this. For instance, Justin Martyr seems to agree with this idea, and it wasn't really until, at least clearly, wasn't until it seems to be Julius Africanus and Augustine that the supernatural view falls out of favor. Professors like Justin Martyr in the Second Apology, section 5, God, when he had made the whole world and subjected things earthly to man, and arranged the heavenly elements for the increase of fruits and rotation of the seasons, and appointed the divine law, for these things also he evidently made for man, committed the care of men and of all things under heaven to angels, whom he appointed over them. But the angels transgressed this appointment, and were captivated by the love of women, and begat children, who are those that are called demons. And besides, they after subdued the human race to themselves, partly by magical writings, and partly by fears and the punishments they occasioned, and partly by teaching them to offer sacrifices and incense and libations, of which things they stood in need, after they were enslaved by lustful passions, and among men they sowed murders, war, adulteries, intemperate deeds, and all wickedness. So you have Justin, who also agrees with this. So I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to do an appeal to majority here, but the evidence, that there seems to be a lot more in favor of the divine view outside of just the biblical text. And I think the biblical text also has support for it. So that's why we're going to go forward with that one. However, if you disagree with that view, totally fine. We can discuss those views another day. But just in the interest of time, we'll keep going. The other interesting thing is that it seems to also be a polemic. There is a scholar who is, I think, was one of or the last people who actually know how to use cuneiform and translate it and read it. And so they work on the Amar Anas translates and explains in this entire thing regarding what's called the Apkalu within Mesopotamia, and this seems to also follow the same line of thinking. And considering that this idea is around the same time as the biblical authors, it makes sense that if they've been kind of engaged in discussion before, that they'd be engaged in this discussion here too. Because in the other nations, they seem to be like happy about the Nephilim in the way that they kind of describe the warriors and giants and the kings like this. And the Bible's like, this is a problem. Everyone's like, this is cool, this is great. Bible seems to be like, this is a problem, we can't have this. So it seems to be like when you consider all these different things, I lean this direction. However, you can still argue I think the royal king is probably the next best one. Set that view, I think is really weak, comparatively. So if you want to read more about that, I've given you the title here. It's On the Orders of Watchers, a comparative study of the antediluvian wisdom in Mesopotamian and Jewish traditions. And for a briefer explanation, you can go to Heiser's Demons, chapter 5. So it would seem that this rebellion results in the flood, which is supposed to purify the land of stuff. And then we see in the New Testament and in Second Temple Judaism that it seems to also involve the imprisonment of the ones who rebelled against God. If you go to like 2 Peter 2:4, it says that for God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus. Tartarus is known in Greek to be like the lowest place in the underworld, like is the place that you would like put prisons and all these things. So he's saying that down there in Tartarus are the spirits, the angels, when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And it keeps going. You could say, okay, why can't this be anyone? It seems to be that the context is also talking about Noah's flood. So it seems to be that it's referring to angels and Noah's flood. Therefore, there's something spiritual here. At least it seems to be in that case. You also have the Nephilim would be the product of this mixture. And their descendants are known as the Anakim, who are also linked to our earlier word, the Rephaim. So you have Nephilim linked to Anakim, which is linked to Nephilim. I say Nephilim twice? Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim. All connected, and they're talking about like them as their descendants and their connection and this big thing. This is why we tied back to Rephaim very much earlier in the notes. We have in Numbers 13:33, the return of the Nephilim, who are the sons of Anak, or the Anakim, and it says that they come from the Nephilim. So you also have Deuteronomy 2:10 through 11. And then 1 Enoch 6:14 discusses the idea of these spiritual beings being trapped and locked up, as well as their offspring. So you kind of get all this stuff that's just happening that seems to be this idea that this might be a spiritual view. If you want to know more about Tartarus, I included 2 different commentaries that kind of explore the Jewish view and how it mixed with the Greek view in here below, such as Greek mythology regarding Tartarus, and as well as the spirits in prison and all that kind of stuff. So if this is true, we have 2 sets of ontological bad guys beyond just human rebels. One who were the vile mixture of divine and human that has died and are not disembodied spirits. The other being rebellious spiritual beings. Because the Rephaim reappear and the Anakim appear, and they are in conflict with Israel. They're in conflict spiritually and physically and all these things. So one event involves a single rebel. The second event involves a group who rebelled and crossed cosmic boundaries. We have unnatural mixtures. If we go to the third rebellion, which is Genesis 11, you get the Tower of Babel. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. So it's here that God says, let us go down, and confuse their language so they may understand one another's speech. You then have Deuteronomy 32, where it discusses the fact that they are divided amongst, in some spots, it says the sons of Israel. And we talked about why that doesn't really work. I'm using the Masoretic translation there because I'm hoping that kind of rings the bell. But remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls says sons of God. So some may argue that these angels were good, but then later became corrupted. Others may say that they were already corrupt and God gives them over to them. And so within these 3 rebellions, if you kind of just go through everything that kind of plays out, there's this constant conflict of idol worship, which involves spiritual beings up there that you worship, if we talk about this class 1 and 2 idea, and 3, it's this, you have the spiritual rebels that are up there that are being worshipped and begin over to these things. But then you also have the Rephaim, which have had a physical presence and a spiritual presence in conflict with the people, especially in the earlier side of the Tanakh. And then we get into the words, the wisdom literature, they reappear in spiritual language. And there's also this idea of the passing between death and life and the spirits that are involved in that. But they also have the spirits who are over the nations and leading in corruption and destruction. So there seems to be like this, like just like we had like this whole class of angels, there seems like a whole bunch of classes of spiritual beings that are on the bad guy side. You have the devil, you have the other spirits, and if this is true, you then potentially have the disembodied mixture of the Nephilim, Rephaim, Anakim. That's the short version of the Old Testament. So much more can be said, but we'll go on the Second Temple. I found someone who's so much smarter than me and quoted him 3 times because he did a better job than I can. But I'll summarize his writings here because I want, and just for the sake of interest of time. So, Daniel C. Harlow with Eshel Esther writes I think a pretty good explanation of the Second Temple period. And we're going to cruise that just because I've already referenced several of the texts. In short, what he kind of gets at is that within their literature, there are 2 main explanations regarding the origin of evil spirits and demons. So according to some texts, such as Enoch and some other places, you have that the demons, as like Justin Martyr would say, are the product of the Genesis 6 mixture. And therefore, demons technically would be like the disembodied Nephilim. You have others who are saying that they were created this way within the Second Temple, and there's like this dualism that is there, which obviously Jews later rejected and Christians rejected. We don't accept dualism. That doesn't work. We're not saying there's a good God and a bad God, or that he creates evil. That'd be a big no-no if God is the source of evil. So that's not to say that, therefore, this over here is correct. It's just that is the general thoughts amongst the Jews. And if we could summarize it briefly, some are saying demons, there are evil spirits who rebelled against God, but there's also the demons, and the demons would be the bad mixture. And then some are saying that it's this weird dualism. What is not being rejected is that there are those of God's heavenly realm that have rebelled against him. That is very clear. It's just a question of, what do you do about the Nephilim? One of the thoughts that is had is because they're a mixture.
Yeah.
One of the thoughts that some Jews had was that demon possession is done of them because they're trying to claim back bodies because they've lost their body. They're trying to become bodied again versus spiritual beings who can appear in bodily form. But then also it kind of calls them as shades. You know, if you think back to Caleb's idea of the dark figures and all these things, that gets into the idea of shades. With Rephaim, which seems to be tied to dead spirits. Again, this is not me saying outright this is true. I will say if you follow the logic with which I go with, that this is kind of the logic you kind of end up with, it seems, for the spiritual beings. I think that's where the logic leads for Genesis 6. But I'm not outright saying with authority, this is the only way to do this. I'm saying here's the evidence and here's where my mind is at. So within their thought, because they are, you have spiritual beings who are rebellion and they're causing things, are tempting people to do things, but and they're trying to lead nations into destruction. But then you have potentially Nephilim or Rephaim who are supposedly the demons, and then they are the ones that are doing more of the demon possessing. At least that's how Justin Martyr seemed to see it. Doesn't mean he's right. Doesn't mean I'm right. This is just where my mind is at with the evidence. Take that with as you will.
The evil spirits are the ones who rebelled against God.
If I were to classify them differently, we would have rebellious spirits, and then it seems to be demons. At least within the Second Temple thought, there seems to be a slight distinction between the two. Then again, they also speculated a whole crap ton, so they could be wrong. But here, to quote, quick thing down here, demonology, the Second Temple period, seems to emphasize a clear distinction between angels and demons. A demon is a non-corporeal being, neither human nor angelic, that causes harm and mischief to human in a variety of ways. The Dead Sea Scrolls use mainly general terms such as spirit of the angels of destruction, spirit of the bastards, and demons. In the sectarian texts from Qumran, two evil spirits and proper names, Belial and Mastema, these figures make their first appearance in Jubilees and show up later in other Jewish sources. Although their origins never explicitly related, in character and earthly doing, they resemble the evil spirits described by the Watchers myth insofar as they lead human beings astray. To quote Michael Heiser, why are they called bastard spirits? Because that is what they are. If we take that idea, bastard being illegitimate child, if we're saying that if we're calling them that, or at least if they're calling them that, that seems to imply that they are a source of something that is illegitimate. So that's where you kind of get this idea, is that they seem to be linking demons as bastard spirits, and then angels, which is why Justin Martyr just calls all spiritual beings angels in his second apologies. These are the angels, and then these are the demons. He's kind of like doing an ontological difference versus angel means strictly good guy. Because again, it's not until really the medieval period that angel strictly means good guy, demon means bad guy. And then that's when we kind of clump all spiritual beings into those two categories. So we've discussed in The Devil Knows that the devil is referred to as the ruler of this world, and as the one wielding the power of death. He becomes the focus insofar as referring to him as the primary enemy. We will not focus on him. One, for the sake of time. Two, we've done this before. I think you all have the notes still. It's in Spawned, so it's there. We don't really need to jump back into that. So, general terms, you have pneuma, which is translated, that's like the equivalent of ruach, meaning spirit, breath, and stuff. Daimon, I mentioned this is tricky. So it's a tricky one, as this form is only used once in the New Testament, of which is being used to refer to in other Greek texts as gods and lesser deities. General supernatural beings, we see in the context of Matthew that these are ones in rebellion to God. The daimon in this passage have possessed a man and are requesting to go into the pigs. So they're lesser gods or lesser deities. So this is where some could say, okay, maybe the demons aren't the disembodied Nephilim because of how it's used. It's only used once though, so there's not a lot of information, but they are shown to be possessing here. However, we could also say that if the Rephaim theory is true, they are in a sense lesser deities because they're not even truly a spiritual being. They're not even truly a human being. They're this weird mixture, this vile mixture of sort. So they're still technically lesser. So you can kind of argue it both ways. You get daimonizomai, almost always linked to oppression and possession. I mean, I think if you go through almost every appearance of this word, it's an idea of demon oppressing people and possessing them. Caleb has gone over that before in his demon possession notes. You get daimonion. These are beings who have a ruler that is the devil. They are frequently mentioned of being cast out of people. Interesting, Luke refers to one as an unclean demon in chapter 4. So you have one is specifically called by Luke, and I think Luke uses this the most. and uses here to refer to it as it's unclean. We'll get into why I think that's interesting. So they enter people and are had by people that are seeking to destroy and kill them. They also teach. So they kind of, they have this knowledge. Well, it makes sense, regardless of which view you go with or how you understand demons, whether it be strictly just rebellious spiritual beings, Rephaim, or both. They would have been around for a very long time, so they know stuff. So they can teach a lot of weird stuff. They can appeal to you with knowledge. Again, the tricky thing with daimon based words is that it is used in a very broad range in classical Greek texts. Very, very broad range. It depends on the context that they're being used. And sometimes it is used for general spirits, not just evil ones. It is used by human beings, and they're referring to their inner being. It is tied to philosophy regarding like the mind, etc., etc. Akathartos, translated as unclean and impure. That which may not be brought into contact and impurity of action. Some argue for a translation akin to a contaminating spirit rather than unclean spirit. So they're saying that the spirit contaminates and therefore the person's unclean. However, the problem is that it is linked to the spirit. The spirit is the one that's being called unclean. It's not that the human's being called unclean right now. It's the spirit is being called unclean. So there's something unclean about the spirit. Uncleanness in Israel, if we kind of think about ancient Jewish background, for Israel is tied to connections with death and improper mixtures. However, unclean does not equal sin, but sin is unclean. For instance, when two people have the sex, they are unclean. But is sex automatically equated to sin? No. If a married couple gets together, they want to have a child, they do the thing, they're considered unclean. Same thing with giving birth and menstruating. Are those vile things? No. But why are they unclean? For the ancient Jew, the fluids are connected to the life of something. So unclean is not just a bad mixture of something. Unclean is also tied to death itself. When a woman is bleeding out, or when a man discharges, or when they associate with certain foods that were like of animals that have died, which were typically carnivores, they're told like to avoid those ones. They're all associated with death. Leviticus talks about the life being in the blood. You have the idea in Genesis that the blood cries out to God when there is murder. There's something very precious about blood and life connected. And so when that kind of stuff happens, when a fluid's coming out of someone, whether it be in a cycle or in a relation, just use those as examples, they're considered unclean because there's a sense of which life is leaving their body. They kind of had this idea. So it's not even just the idea that it's a sinful action or it's a bad mixture of things. There's association with death. So if we type all that together, put spirits associated with death and unclean mixtures, this would be one of the words that could be a good strong support for Rephaim theory. Daimon, I mentioned before, you can argue it both ways. Whichever you conclude on, and based on the context, determines on how you interpret those. Daimon words, the problem, they're just so broad. But to quote Clinton Whalen, reference to impure spirits and for incantations and to unclean demons and jubilees are clear based on the Watcher myth of First Enoch, whereby evil spirits proceed from dead bodies of the fallen giants who were born as a result of the misgenation of angels with women. These spirits are called unclean in analogy to the similar classification of unclean animals, an unnatural combination of heavenly and earthly beings. They present an anomalous mixture of categories. Continuing on, evil spirits in many Jewish sources ultimately trace their origins to the defiling union of these heavenly beings with women. Like unclean animals, these impure spirits represent an anomalous mixture of categories. So it can be argued that these are unclean spirits because they are the product of an unnatural mixture. They're associated with death. If we think back to our Ob words, where they're like just passing through, and this idea of the Transjordan, which is association with death. They're also associated, but they are of the disembodied bodies. Meaning they had a body, but they're not, so they're trying to reclaim bodies. Meaning that because they've experienced death and remain in such a state, they're unclean in their spirit, because they're just perpetually stuck in death. If we take the Enochian and just a martyr view, demons in this case would be disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. We keep going with a few other words that are interesting. You have arche. This is where we get the rule. We go to Paul, where we talk about the rulers, powers, and principalities. So now we're using words specifically regarding those who have authority and are over things. So we've left the terminology regarding possession. Now we have like these ruler ideas. So you have arche, which is interesting because it's also translated as beginning in a lot of places. So you could say it's like the beginning of the rule, right? The rule starts with this person. Such as in Ephesians 21:21. You also have where it says like the rulers, principalities, powers, and authorities. If you go to a lot of interlinears, they'll put right there in the parenthesis, spiritual being. Because the context is about those spiritual beings. You go to 1 Corinthians, where it talks about like these rulers and that there is something that they didn't know. So when Christ goes on the cross, they do not truly know what's about to happen. There's something that's kept from them. So that way it could not be prevented from Christ going onto the cross. There's something that's concealed from them. And so you have things like dunamios, so power, authority, wicked force, and kuriotes, lordship, authority, dominion. So these four words, as well as a few others, are mentioned due to the fact that Paul frequently used to refer to spiritual beings. For example, Paul opens with them in Ephesians 1, then uses the same terminology to say that they're of the skies and are the ones who actually are wrestling against. So if you go through, Paul uses consistently this terminology for beings that are in the heavens, or mean like are over the skies or over the nations. They have this power and we wrestle against them for like these things. This line of thought is continued in his letter to the Colossians. However, there are instances like in Titus where it does refer to the government. Okay, so again, like there's not a complete separation of government and spiritual beings. So this seems to point to that the rebels of the rulers of the nations, spiritual rebels who are behind things and are still impacting things in cosmic geography, they are rulers. They're the ones that are over the nations. Which we then think about to Acts with Pentecost, I mentioned with divine council, where you see at Pentecost, you see the table of nations are being re-represented as hearing the gospel and the Spirit descending onto them, which is like an undoing of that. So if I summarize all those things, if we went, for instance, just for sake of argument, went with the Rephaim theory of demons, meaning there are demons that are the disembodied spirits and you have the spiritual rebels. You could argue that Jesus' ministry, which is already multifold, but regarding this category is multifold in that he conquers mountains and conquers the mountain of the devil, which he basically declares war in Matthew 4, and then does again over and over again, claiming mountains. Go see our mountain podcast for that. I'm at the Matthew 7 Mountains episode. It's a great time. You also have that the rebels who have some level of authority over the people lose some set of authority, as you see with the book of Acts. The nations are being reclaimed. You have his kingdom as being conquering, so the other kings. He also purifies those who believe and remove the unclean evil spirits. So Jesus is removing unclean spirits, removing from them. And then he's talking about how the spirits can be the helper who will reside in the people. If you think back to image of God, remember that the word image is tied to idols. If we're in our relationship with God, this might be the best analogy, but I'm going to use just to kind of help paint the picture. If we talk about the idea that humans or beings are estranged from God, and we're like his idols, and you have demons are possessing them, and we know that the Holy Spirit, when he's present, that humans can't be possessed when the Holy Spirit's in them, is kind of like in idol imagery that when we were when we were kind of like Romans 1 for our sin, that the other demons tried to claim over these idols, these bodies, but now God has been purifying that and is basically like taking these idols and repurifying them for his purposes. So you could make something up like that. I'm not saying you have to, I'm not saying you necessarily should. I'm just saying just to kind of paint the picture. So you could say the ruler, the one who has preeminence, is cast down and is lost because he has the ultimate power. He seems to have the power over all of them. He seems like the guy that they all follow. You have the ones who have the power over the nations that are losing the nations or losing the people. And you could say that he has been casting out the ones who are trying to take over the bodies. That he's just like a multifold spiritual warfare that he single-handedly destroys. If you go with this theory, go with this understanding. If you don't, you can still come to very strong conclusions. By no means am I saying this is the theory you have to go with. I don't say this is authority. I say this is where my head is at based on the things I've studied. So it could be argued that demons are the disembodied, unclean spirits, hence why the Jews call them bastard spirits and the New Testament calls them unclean, and Justin Martyr calls them demons. And you don't really see, I would argue, until Augustine and Julius Africanus that this is rejected much later. So you have early Christian testimony. Early doesn't mean correct, but we have a lot of evidence that seems to support it. You kind of just go with the evidence at that point. He also had other reasons to kind of argue against it. He was dealing with a lot of issues with people, so it kind of made sense that he was. It would kind of make sense if he was also just kind of really ticked at people and just want to get rid of as much of it as possible. And then you could say that the spiritual beings are also rebels, and then you have the devil, which would cover all three rebellions. That is definitely a possible way to. Therefore, so you have three rebellions, and then Jesus overturns all three rebellions. You can see that in everything with his ministry and what the triune God is doing. That's as short as I can try to condense it, because my notes were going to keep going forever and ever. But that's 19 pages summed up.